Introducción. La interpretación simultánea se utiliza cuando el intérprete escucha y habla al mismo tiempo, transmitiendo el mensaje en el idioma meta con solo unos segundos de retraso. Aparece en el tribunal en instrucciones al jurado, declaraciones iniciales, alegatos de clausura, argumentos de los abogados dirigidos al juez, tramos largos de testimonio. Cualquier situación en la que pausar al orador interrumpiría el flujo. Las destrezas fundamentales que se requieren incluyen memoria a corto plazo, capacidad para anticipar la estructura de las oraciones, reformulación rápida, entonación calmada y constante, excelente dominio de la terminología jurídica. Para practicar la interpretación simultánea, usted tendrá 4 ejercicios. Los 2 primeros son ejercicios de doble canal en la combinación inglés-español. Necesitará audífonos estéreo que le permitan escuchar el audio en inglés por el oído izquierdo y el audio en español por el derecho. También puede escuchar un solo canal a la vez para practicar su versión en cualquier otro idioma. Los otros 2 ejercicios son pistas en audio en un solo canal para que usted practique en cualquier idioma igualmente. Usted debe interpretar de manera continua, sin detenerse, tal como lo hará durante el examen. Aunque la sección real de simultánea dura aproximadamente 7 minutos, estos segmentos de práctica son más cortos para ayudarle a desarrollar resistencia y precisión.
Opening
Declaración
statement.
de apertura.
Ladies and gentlemen
Damas y
of the
caballeros
jury,
del
this
jurado,
case is about
este caso trata
responsibility.
de la
Responsibility for the
la
choices we make
responsabilidad
and
por
for
las
the
decisiones que
consequences that
tomamos y por
follow.
las consecuencias que esas
Over the
decisiones
next several
generan.
days, you will hear
Durante
evidence
los
showing
próximos
that the
días,
defendant,
ustedes
Clearwater
escucharán
Retail
evidencia
Group,
que demostrará que
failed
la
to take
parte
basic,
demandada,
reasonable steps
Clearwater
to keep
Retail
its
Group,
customers
no
safe.
tomó medidas básicas y
And
razonables
because of
para
that
mantener la
failure, my
seguridad de sus
client,
clientes.
Ms. Angela Ruiz,
Y debido a esa
suffered an
falta, mi
injury that
clienta, la
changed the
señora
course of her
Angela
daily
Ruiz,
life.
sufrió una lesión que
On the
cambió el
morning of
rumbo de su
October
vida diaria.
12th, Ms. Ruiz entered
En la
the
mañana
Clearwater
del 12
Market
de
on
octubre,
Pine
la
Street to
señora
buy
Ruiz entró al
groceries,
supermercado
just as
Clearwater
she had done
Market
many
en Pine
times
Street para
before.
comprar víveres,
What she
como lo
did
había
not
hecho
know,
muchas
and
veces
what the
antes.
evidence will show,
Lo que ella
is
no
that a
sabía
refrigeration
y lo
unit
que
in
la
the dairy
evidencia
aisle had been
demostrará
leaking for
es que una unidad
hours.
de refrigeración en el
Employees
pasillo
had
de
walked
lácteos
past the
había
growing
estado
puddle
goteando durante
repeatedly.
horas.
Some even
Los
stepped
empleados
around
habían
it,
pasado junto al
but
charco
no one
una y
cleaned
otra
it,
vez.
no one placed a warning
Algunos
sign,
incluso lo rodearon
and no
para
one closed the
evitarlo.
aisle to
Pero
protect
nadie lo
customers.
limpió, nadie
You
colocó
will
un
hear
aviso de
testimony
advertencia
from
y
store
nadie cerró el
employees
pasillo
who
para
admit they
proteger a
were
los clientes.
short-staffed that day,
Ustedes
and that they had
escucharán
been
el testimonio
instructed
de
to
empleados de la tienda
prioritize
que
speed
admiten que
over
ese día
safety.
tenían poco personal
You will
y
see
que se les
internal
había
reports
indicado
showing that the
priorizar la
same
rapidez por
refrigeration
encima de
unit
la
had
seguridad.
malfunctioned twice in the
Verán
previous
informes
month.
internos que muestran que esa
And you will
misma
learn that
unidad
the
de
company had been
refrigeración había
warned
fallado
more than
2 veces
once
el
that
mes
its
anterior.
maintenance schedule was
Y sabrán
inadequate.
que la empresa había sido
When
advertida
Ms.
más
Ruiz
de una
stepped
vez
into that
de que
aisle,
su
she had
programa de
no reason to
mantenimiento era
expect danger.
insuficiente.
She
Cuando
slipped,
la señora
fell
Ruiz
hard
entró
on
en
her
ese
right
pasillo
side,
no
and
tenía razón
immediately
alguna
felt
para
a
esperar
sharp
un
pain in her
peligro.
hip and lower back.
Resbaló, cayó con
The
fuerza sobre
medical
su lado
records you will
derecho y
see
sintió de
confirm that
inmediato
she
un dolor
suffered a
agudo en la
lumbar
cadera y
strain
la
and a
parte baja de la
hairline
espalda.
fracture.
Los
Injuries that
registros médicos
required
que
weeks
ustedes
of
verán
treatment
confirman
and
que
months of
sufrió un
physical
esguince lumbar
therapy.
y una fractura mínima,
The defense may
lesiones
argue
que
that
requirieron
accidents
semanas de
happen, that
tratamiento
no
y
store
meses de
can prevent every
fisioterapia.
hazard.
La defensa
But
podría
the law
argumentar
does
que
not
los
require
accidentes ocurren,
perfection.
que ninguna
It
tienda puede
requires
prevenir
reasonable
todos los
care.
riesgos.
And
Pero
the
la ley
evidence
no
will
exige
show that
perfección,
Clearwater Retail
exige un
Group did
cuidado
not meet that
razonable,
standard.
y la evidencia
They knew
demostrará
about the
que
leak,
Clearwater
they
Retail
ignored
Group
it,
no cumplió con ese estándar.
and their inaction
Sabían
caused
del
real
escape de
harm
agua,
to a real
lo
person.
ignoraron, y su
At
inacción
the end of
causó un
this
daño
trial,
real
we
a
will
una
ask you to
persona
return
real.
a verdict that
Al
reflects the
final de
truth
este
of what
juicio les
happened
pediremos
and
que
the
emitan un
responsibility
veredicto que
the
refleje la
defendant
verdad
failed
de lo
to
ocurrido
uphold.
y la
We
responsabilidad
will
que la
ask you
parte
to find in
demandada no
favor of
asumió.
Ms. Ruiz.
Les pediremos que fallen
Thank
a
you.
favor de la señora Ruiz. Gracias.
Closing statement. Ladies
Declaración
and
de
gentlemen of the
clausura.
jury, over
Damas
the
y
course of
caballeros
this
del jurado,
trial, you have
a lo
heard
largo de este
testimony,
juicio ustedes
reviewed
han escuchado
documents, and listened
testimonio,
to
revisado
experts.
documentos
And
y
now,
atendido a
as we reach
expertos.
the end, your
Y ahora, al
task is
llegar
to
al final,
evaluate
su tarea
all
es
of that
evaluar toda
evidence
esa
and
evidencia
determine
y
what is
determinar
fair,
qué es justo,
what is
qué es
reasonable,
razonable
and
y
what
qué
is
es
just.
correcto.
This case is
Este
not about
caso no se trata de
speculation or
suposiciones
assumptions.
ni de
It is about
conjeturas.
facts.
Se
Facts
trata de
that show
hechos,
the defendant
hechos que
had
demuestran
multiple
que la parte
opportunities to
demandada tuvo
prevent the
múltiples
harm that occurred
oportunidades para
and
prevenir el
chose
daño
not
que
to act.
ocurrió y
You
decidió no
heard from
actuar.
witnesses who described
Ustedes
clear
escucharon
warning
a testigos
signs.
describir
You saw
señales
internal
claras de
emails
advertencia.
acknowledging the problem weeks
Vieron
before
correos
the
internos
incident.
que reconocían
And you
el
listened to
problema
experts
semanas
who
antes del
explained how a
incidente.
simple,
Y escucharon a
inexpensive safety
expertos
measure
explicar cómo
would have
una medida
avoided
de
the
seguridad
injury
simple y
entirely.
económica habría
The
evitado por
defense has
completo la
suggested
lesión.
that the event was
La defensa ha
unpredictable,
sugerido
that
que
no
el
one could
evento
have
fue
foreseen it.
impredecible,
But the
que nadie
evidence
pudo
tells a
haberlo
different
previsto.
story. The risk
Pero la
was known.
evidencia cuenta
The
otra
danger
historia.
was documented.
El riesgo era
And the
conocido,
defendant
el
failed to
peligro
take the
estaba
steps that
documentado,
any reasonable
y la parte
organization would have
demandada
taken
no tomó las
under the
medidas
same
que cualquier
circumstances.
organización
You also
razonable
heard from
habría
my
tomado en
client,
las mismas
who did not ask to
circunstancias.
be in this situation.
También
She did
escucharon a mi
not choose
clienta,
to be
quien
injured,
no pidió
to
estar
miss
en
work,
esta
or to
situación.
spend months in treatment.
Ella no
She
eligió
simply
lesionarse,
expected the
faltar al
defendant to
trabajo
follow
ni
the
pasar
basic
meses sin
standards of
tratamiento.
care that protect all of
Simplemente
us
esperaba que
in
la
our
parte
daily
demandada
lives.
cumpliera con los
When those
estándares
standards were
básicos de cuidado
ignored,
que nos
she
protegen a
paid the
todos en
price.
nuestra vida diaria.
Your role today is
Cuando
not
esos
to
estándares
punish
fueron
or to
ignorados,
reward.
ella pagó
Your
el
role
precio.
is to weigh the
Su
evidence and
función hoy
decide
no es
whether the
castigar ni
defendant should be held
recompensar.
accountable
Su función
for the
es
harm
sopesar
their
la evidencia
inaction
y decidir
caused.
si la parte
The law
demandada
provides a
debe
remedy
rendir
when
cuentas
someone
por
is
el daño
injured
que su
because
inacción
another
causó.
party failed to act
La ley ofrece un
responsibly.
remedio
That
cuando alguien
remedy is a
resulta
verdict in
lesionado
favor
porque
of the
otra
injured
parte no
person.
actuó de manera
At the end of
responsable.
this case, we
Ese
ask you to
remedio es un
return a
veredicto
verdict
a
that
favor de la
reflects the
persona
truth you
lesionada.
have seen and heard.
Al concluir este
A verdict
caso,
that
les pedimos que
acknowledges the
emitan un
harm,
veredicto que refleje
recognizes
la
the
verdad que han visto y
responsibility,
escuchado.
and upholds the
Un
principles
veredicto
of
que
fairness
reconozca el daño,
that our justice
identifique
system
la
is built
responsabilidad y
upon.
reafirme los
We ask
principios
you
de
to find
justicia
in
sobre los
favor of the
cuales se basa
plaintiff.
nuestro sistema.
Thank you.
Les pedimos que fallen a favor de la parte demandante. Gracias.
Closing argument. The mislabeling incident. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you heard a great deal about procedures, labels, and workplace routines. But at its core, this case is about something much simpler. Responsibility. Not abstract responsibility, not theoretical responsibility, but the responsibility each of us carries when our actions affect the safety and well-being of others. The defendant wants you to believe that the mislabeling of a chemical container was a harmless mistake, a momentary oversight in a busy warehouse. But the evidence shows something very different. You heard testimony from the safety supervisor, who explained that the defendant had been trained repeatedly on proper labeling procedures. You saw the written warnings issued in the months leading up to the incident. And you heard from co-workers who described a pattern of rushing through tasks and ignoring established protocols. Now, no one is saying the defendant intended to cause harm. Intent is not the issue here. The issue is whether the defendant acted with the level of care that the law requires. And when a mislabeled container leads to an employee suffering chemical burns, we cannot simply shrug and say, well, mistakes happen. Mistakes do happen, but preventable mistakes, repeated mistakes, and careless mistakes have consequences. The defense argued that the warehouse was understaffed, that the workload was heavy, and that management should have provided more support. Those concerns may be valid, but they do not erase the defendant's duty to follow the safety rules that protect everyone in that facility. Every workplace has pressures. Every job has moments of stress. But the law does not allow us to set aside safety because we are in a hurry. You also heard from the injured employee, who described the pain, the medical treatment, and the weeks of recovery that followed. That testimony was not dramatic. It was not exaggerated. It was honest. And it showed the very real human impact of what some would prefer to call a minor oversight. In this courtroom, we deal with facts. And the facts show that the defendant knew the rules, ignored the rules, and caused harm as a result. That is negligence. Plain and simple. So I ask you to return a verdict that reflects the truth of what happened. A verdict that acknowledges the harm done. A verdict that reinforces the principle that safety rules matter. Not just when it's convenient, but every single day. Thank you.
Expert witness testimony, physiological effects of prolonged starvation. Members of the jury, my role today is to explain, in clear medical terms, what happens to the human body when a person is deprived of food for many days. The process is not sudden. It unfolds in stages, each one more dangerous than the last, and each one entirely predictable from a medical standpoint. When a person stops receiving adequate nutrition, the body first relies on glucose, which is the simplest and most immediate source of energy. Glucose is stored in the liver and muscles in the form of glycogen. Those stores are limited, and under normal conditions they are exhausted within the first 24 hours. During this initial period, the person may feel weak, lightheaded, or irritable, but the body is still functioning on its most accessible fuel. Once the glucose supply is depleted, the body enters the second stage, fat metabolism. Fat reserves become the primary source of energy. The body breaks down fatty acids and converts them into ketones, which can sustain the brain and other organs for a period of time. This stage can last several days, depending on the individual's health and body composition. However, even while fat is being used for energy, the person becomes progressively more fatigued, dehydrated, and mentally sluggish. Concentration declines, physical strength diminishes, and the body begins to conserve energy by slowing many normal functions. The most dangerous stage begins when the fat reserves are no longer sufficient. At that point, the body turns to protein breakdown. This means the body begins consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. It does not distinguish between muscles used for movement and muscles essential for life. The heart, the diaphragm, and the muscles involved in breathing all begin to weaken. The immune system becomes severely compromised, making the person vulnerable to infections that would normally be easy to fight off. As protein loss accelerates, the individual experiences profound weakness, confusion, and an inability to perform even simple tasks. Blood pressure drops, heart rhythm becomes unstable, and the body can no longer maintain normal temperature or fluid balance. Without intervention, this cascade leads to multi-organ failure. Ultimately, the heart becomes too weak to sustain life. It is important to understand that starvation is not a quiet or painless process. It is physically exhausting, mentally disorienting, and medically catastrophic. And from a clinical perspective, it is entirely preventable. When a person is left without adequate food for many days, the outcome follows this same sequence, and without timely care, the result is fatal.
Gracias por practicar con nosotros. Recuerde, el progreso en la interpretación simultánea proviene de un entrenamiento constante y enfocado. Siga adelante. Usted está desarrollando una destreza que realmente marca la diferencia.